Mid-Atlantic, July 13, 1943, 0600 hours, and Oberleutnant Helmut Metz commanding U-487 surfaced his Type 14 submarine 760 miles southwest of the Azores, watching the dawn horizon for any sign of danger while his crew prepared to transfer fuel to 3 attack boats waiting nearby, completely unaware that 2 American aircraft from escort carrier USS Card were already tracking him from 12 miles away, their radar painting his submarine on screens he didn't know existed, their pilots preparing to unleash weapons his detection equipment couldn't warn him about. The first of 53 German submarines that would fall to escort carrier hunter-killer groups in a campaign that would transform the Battle of the Atlantic from German triumph to catastrophic defeat. The morning air hung thick with Atlantic moisture as Metz's lookouts scanned empty ocean in every direction, finding nothing but endless swells and the 3 Type VII attack boats approaching for their scheduled refueling, U-66, U-117, and U-664 running low on diesel after weeks of hunting Allied convoys. Their commanders desperate for the fuel that would let them continue operations, none of them realizing they had been betrayed by their own radio transmissions, decoded by Allied intelligence. Their exact position transmitted to Captain Arnold Isbell commanding the escort carrier USS Card, and her hunter-killer group prowling these waters specifically to find them. Metz had chosen this position carefully, 400 miles from the nearest Allied airbase, far beyond the range of any land-based aircraft, in what German submarine command called the air gap or black pit. Waters where U-boats had operated with impunity since 1940, surfacing freely during daylight to recharge batteries, conduct repairs and transfer supplies, the one place in the Atlantic where Grossadmiral Karl Dönitz promised his commanders they would be safe from aircraft attack. The Milch Cow submarine U-487 displaced 1,600 tons, and carried 432 tons of fuel oil plus 4 spare torpedoes to resupply the smaller attack boats that hunted Allied convoys. One of 10 Type 14 submarines that allowed the German Wolfpacks to extend their patrols by weeks, multiplying their effectiveness in strangling Britain's supply lines, each tanker submarine capable of refueling 12 Type VII boats during a single patrol, turning the mid-Atlantic into a German hunting ground where U-boats sank over 500,000 tons of Allied shipping in March 1943 alone. Metz had surfaced precisely at dawn to begin the complex refueling operation that required both submarines to maintain steady courses while fuel hoses were connected and hundreds of tons of diesel oil pumped between vessels. A process that took hours during which both boats remained vulnerable on the surface, unable to dive quickly if attacked, trusting in the vast emptiness of the ocean and their distance from land to protect them. At 0637, Lieutenant Commander Charles Brewer flying the lead Wildcat fighter spotted a wake on the surface and immediately called his wingman, the 2 aircraft of Composite Squadron 13 having launched from USS Card before dawn, flying a standard search pattern that extended 150 miles from their carrier, each aircraft equipped with radar that could detect a surface submarine at 15 miles, extending their search capability far beyond what German naval intelligence believed possible. The 2-plane team consisted of Brewer's F-4F Wildcat fighter and a TBF Avenger torpedo bomber piloted by Lieutenant Junior Grade Earl Steiger, the standard hunter-killer combination that escort carriers employed, the Wildcat suppressing anti-aircraft fire while the Avenger delivered the killing blow with depth charges, or the new Mark 24 acoustic homing torpedo that the Americans code-named Fido. Brewer pushed his Wildcat into a shallow dive from 8,000 feet, approaching from the sun to mask his arrival while Steiger positioned his Avenger for an attack run. Both pilots following tactics developed over months of operations in the Atlantic, knowing that surprise was essential because a diving U-boat became almost impossible to destroy once it reached 50 feet below the surface. The German lookouts spotted the aircraft at 4 miles, much too late for U-487 to dive, and Metz ordered his anti-aircraft gunners to their weapons, 2 20mm cannons and a 37mm gun that gave the submarine formidable defensive firepower if the crew had time to man them. But the Americans were already into their attack runs, Brewer's Wildcat strafing the conning tower with 650 caliber machine guns while Steiger's Avenger roared in from the port quarter. The Avenger dropped 4 depth charges that straddled U-487's hull, the explosions lifting the submarine partially out of the water and throwing men from the anti-aircraft guns into the sea. But somehow the pressure hull remained intact and Metz managed to crash dive, taking his damaged boat down while Brewer called for reinforcements, knowing that a second attack team was already airborne from Card and heading their way. Within minutes, Lieutenant Robert Williams arrived with another Wildcat Avenger team, finding oil and debris marking where U-487 had submerged. Williams immediately dropping a phytoacoustic torpedo that acquired the submarine's propeller noise and tracked it relentlessly through the water. The explosion at 0715 breaking U-487's hull and sending her to the bottom with all 58 hands, the first of 3 submarines that Corps' aircraft would destroy that day. The destruction of U-487 sent shock waves through the German submarine force because she had been operating in waters considered absolutely safe from air attack. Her position carefully calculated to be beyond the range of any Allied aircraft based in Iceland, Greenland, Newfoundland, or the Azores, yet somehow American naval aircraft had appeared from nowhere, attacked with devastating precision, and disappeared back into the empty ocean, leaving 3 attack submarines without fuel and forced to abort their patrols. Admiral Dönitz initially refused to believe the reports, insisting that U-487 must have been attacked by a long-range Liberator operating at the extreme limit of its range. But when U-664 was caught and sunk by Corps' aircraft on August 9, followed by U-525 on August 11, both in positions impossible for land-based aircraft to reach, he was forced to confront a terrible new reality. The Allies had found a way to project air power into the mid-Atlantic gap. What Dönitz didn't know was that the United States Navy had converted merchant ships and oil tankers into small aircraft carriers specifically designed to hunt submarines. Ships that could operate independently of convoys with their own hunter-killer groups, free to pursue U-boats wherever intelligence indicated they might be found, each escort carrier operating 28 aircraft, a combination of Wildcat fighters and Avenger torpedo bombers that could search thousands of square miles of ocean each day. The escort carrier represented a revolution in anti-submarine warfare that German naval intelligence completely failed to anticipate. Their war plans based on the assumption that aircraft carriers would be too valuable to waste on convoy protection, that the few dozen fleet carriers the Allies possessed would be needed for battle fleet operations, never imagining that America's industrial might could produce over 100 escort carriers during the war, 78 of the Casablanca class, alone built by Henry Kaiser's shipyards in less than 2 years. USS Card, designated CVE-13, displaced 7,800 tons and measured 512 feet in length. Her flight deck barely 2/3 the length of a fleet carrier. Her maximum speed of 19 knots too slow to keep up with the fast carrier task forces, but perfectly adequate for hunting submarines that could only make 17 knots on the surface and 7 submerged. Her air group trained specifically for anti-submarine warfare with tactics developed through months of operational experience. Captain Marshall Greer commanded Corps with 860 officers and men, most of them reserves who had been civilians 2 years earlier, now operating one of the most sophisticated weapon systems in the Atlantic, their carrier equipped with radar, high-frequency direction finding equipment to track German radio transmissions, and intelligence support that often told them exactly where to find their prey. The hunter-killer group that Corps led included 4 destroyer escorts, purpose-built submarine hunters that were smaller and slower than fleet destroyers but equipped with improved sonar, Hedgehog anti-submarine mortars, and enough depth charges to sustain prolonged attacks on submerged targets. The destroyers working in coordination with the carrier's aircraft to trap U-boats on the surface or hunt them down if they managed to dive. This combination of persistent air search and surface prosecution proved devastatingly effective, the aircraft forcing submarines to remain submerged where their battery endurance limited them to a few hours of slow-speed operation, the destroyers then closing in with sonar to deliver the killing blow, a tactical revolution that transformed the hunters into the hunted. By August 1943, 6 American escort carriers operated in the Atlantic with their hunter-killer groups. USS Bogue, Card, Corps, Santee, Block Island, and Croatan, each carrier's air group developing its own tactics and techniques for finding and destroying U-boats, their commanders given extraordinary freedom to hunt independently based on intelligence from the 10th Fleet headquarters in Washington that coordinated all American anti-submarine operations. The 10th Fleet, commanded by Admiral Ernest King himself, used ultra-intelligence from decoded German radio messages to vector the hunter-killer groups toward U-boat concentrations, particularly focusing on the Type 14 tanker submarines whose destruction would cripple the entire U-boat offensive by forcing attack boats to abort their patrols for lack of fuel. The impact on German operations was immediate and catastrophic, U-boat commanders who had operated with confidence in the mid-Atlantic suddenly finding themselves under constant threat of air attack, never knowing when aircraft might appear from empty ocean, forcing them to remain submerged during daylight hours when they desperately needed to surface for battery charging, dramatically reducing their mobility and effectiveness. Captain Lieutenant Horst Uphoff commanding U-84 reported to Dönitz that he had been forced to dive 18 times in a single day by aircraft that seemed to appear from nowhere. His batteries exhausted, his crew demoralized, unable to understand how the enemy could maintain such persistent air coverage hundreds of miles from the nearest land base, finally forced to surface at night only to be caught by radar-equipped aircraft and sunk with all hands. The German submarine force had based its entire Atlantic strategy on the concept of the Wolfpack, groups of 6 to 12 U-boats that would converge on convoys for coordinated night surface attacks, using their 17-knot surface speed to outmaneuver the slower merchant ships and their escorts, attacking from multiple directions to overwhelm the defenses, tactics that had proved devastatingly effective in 1940 and 41. But the Wolfpack tactics required extensive radio communication to coordinate the boats, transmissions that Allied direction-finding equipment could track, and most critically, they required the ability to surface freely to achieve the speed and mobility that made the tactics work, capabilities that escort carrier aircraft destroyed completely, forcing U-boats to remain submerged where they could barely keep up with a 7-knot convoy. Lieutenant Commander William Drain commanded Composite Squadron 9 aboard USS Bogue, developing what became the standard escort carrier anti-submarine tactics, using teams of 1 Wildcat fighter and 1 Avenger torpedo bomber that worked in close coordination, the fighter suppressing anti-aircraft fire while the bomber made its attack run. Both aircraft equipped with radios that allowed them to coordinate their attacks precisely. On June 4, 1943, Drain's squadron found 3 U-boats on the surface in broad daylight, U-228, U-641, and U-603, all charging batteries after a night of chasing convoy Gus 7. The German commanders confident they were beyond aircraft range, their lookouts scanning empty horizons while their detection equipment showed no radar signals, unaware that the new American centimetric radar operated on frequencies their receivers couldn't detect. The attack on the 3 submarines demonstrated the shock and confusion that escort carrier aircraft created among U-boat crews, the Germans having less than 30 seconds from the first visual sighting to respond, barely enough time to sound the alarm before bombs and depth charges were exploding around their hulls, their anti-aircraft gunners struggling to bring weapons to bear against aircraft approaching at 200 miles per hour from different directions. U-228 managed to crash dive just as the depth charges exploded, her pressure hull cracked but holding, limping back to France with 40 feet of her bow crushed. U-641 took direct hits that destroyed her diesel engines but somehow remained afloat long enough for her crew to abandon ship, while U-603 dove successfully but was so damaged by near misses that she could barely maintain depth control, surfacing and diving repeatedly while American aircraft circled overhead like vultures. The psychological impact on U-boat crews was perhaps even greater than the physical destruction. Men who had thought themselves hunters suddenly transformed into prey, never knowing when aircraft might appear. The empty ocean that had been their sanctuary becoming a trap where they could be caught and killed without warning. Their commanders reporting increasing cases of what they called aircraft psychosis, among crews who insisted they could hear aircraft engines even when submerged. Oberleutnant Klaus Rudloff commanding U-609 wrote in his war diary that his lookouts had become jumpy as cats, seeing aircraft in every cloud, hearing engines in the wind, forcing crash dives that exhausted his batteries and left him unable to pursue convoys. His patrol ending with 0 ships sunk after 45 days at sea, a complete reversal of the success U-boats had enjoyed just months earlier. The escort carriers didn't just hunt submarines, they provided air cover for convoys that eliminated one of the U-boats' greatest advantages, the ability to shadow convoys on the surface using their superior speed to position themselves ahead for night attacks. Tactics that had allowed single submarines to sink multiple ships from a convoy by attacking, diving to escape, then surfacing to race ahead and attack again. With escort carrier aircraft maintaining constant patrols around convoys, U-boats could no longer surface within visual range during daylight, and at night, radar-equipped Avengers could detect them at ranges up to 15 miles, vectoring in destroyers for the kill or attacking themselves with the new Fido homing torpedoes that could track a submarine even in complete darkness. The Fido torpedo, officially designated Mark 24 mine to maintain security, represented another technological surprise that shocked German submarine commanders. An acoustic homing weapon that could pursue a diving submarine by tracking the sound of its propellers, impossible to evade by the standard tactic of turning hard to port or starboard that worked against conventional depth charges. Lieutenant Junior Grade John Ballantyne flying from USS Block Island scored the first Fido kill on May 14, 1943, sinking U-266 in the mid-Atlantic, the German crew never understanding what hit them. their submarine simply exploding without warning 40 feet below the surface. Only 13 men surviving from a crew of 51, pulled from the water hours later by the destroyer escorts and interrogated extensively about their submarine's equipment and tactics. German naval intelligence struggled to understand what was happening. Their submarines disappearing without explanation in waters that should have been safe. The survivors who were rescued reporting attacks by aircraft types they didn't recognize. Speaking of carriers where no carriers should exist. Describing weapons that seemed to chase their submarines underwater. Stories that seemed so impossible that Dönitz initially dismissed them as hysteria. But as the evidence mounted through the summer of 1943, with submarine after submarine lost in the mid-Atlantic, their final radio messages reporting aircraft attacks in positions beyond the range of any known Allied airbase, Dönitz was forced to conclude that the Allies had developed some new capability that German intelligence had completely missed, ordering his technical staff to investigate while simultaneously changing his tactics to avoid whatever threat the Allies had deployed. The German response demonstrated their complete failure to understand the escort carrier threat, Dönitz ordering his submarines to stay on the surface and fight it out with attacking aircraft using enhanced anti-aircraft armament, converting several submarines into flak boats with additional guns, believing that U-boats could shoot down enough aircraft to make the attacks too costly to continue. This decision proved catastrophic when U-boat gunners discovered that escort carrier aircraft didn't attack individually but in coordinated teams, the Wildcat fighters strafing from one direction while Avengers bombed from another, the submarine's anti-aircraft guns unable to engage multiple targets simultaneously, their crews exposed on deck being cut down by machine gun fire while trying to man their weapons. U-758 became one of the first victims of the enhanced anti-aircraft strategy on May 8, 1943. Her commander Captain Lieutenant Helmut Manzek under orders to remain surfaced and fight when attacked by aircraft from escort carrier USS Bogue. His crew manning two 20mm cannons and a 37mm gun, putting up what Manzek thought was effective defensive fire until the American aircraft split up and attacked from opposite directions simultaneously. The Wildcat's 650 caliber machine guns swept U-758's deck, killing or wounding every man topside including Manzek himself, while the Avenger planted 4 depth charges in a perfect straddle that broke the submarine's back, the entire action lasting less than 90 seconds from first sighting to the submarine's destruction, only 5 men surviving from a crew of 48, their testament revealing the futility of trying to fight carrier aircraft with submarine anti-aircraft guns. The Battle of the Bay of Biscay in the summer of 1943 demonstrated how completely escort carriers and land-based aircraft working together could dominate previously safe waters. German submarines forced to run a gauntlet of air attacks from the moment they left their concrete pens on the French coast, RAF Coastal Command Sunderlands and Liberators patrolling by day, Lee Light-equipped Wellingtons hunting by night, and if a U-boat somehow made it through to the open Atlantic, American escort carrier groups waited to continue the hunt. The bay that U-boat crews had crossed routinely on the surface in 1940 and 41, taking just a day to reach the relative safety of deep water, now required 5 days of nerve-wracking travel, submerged by day, surfacing only briefly at night to charge batteries, knowing that at any moment aircraft might appear with that terrible blazing white light that meant depth charges were already falling. By September 1943, Dönitz faced the complete collapse of his U-boat offensive, 41 submarines lost in May alone in what the Germans called Black May. Another 37 in June and July, mostly to aircraft attack, his remaining commanders reporting that they could no longer operate effectively in the North Atlantic, forced to remain submerged so much that their batteries couldn't sustain pursuit of convoys, their crews exhausted and demoralized by constant air attack. The carefully constructed strategy of tonnage warfare, sinking Allied merchant ships faster than they could be replaced, had reversed completely. The Allies now sinking U-boats faster than German shipyards could build them while American shipyards produced Liberty ships at a rate that made merchant vessel losses irrelevant, some yards launching a new ship every single day. The German naval staff struggled to comprehend how completely the tactical situation had changed, their pre-war calculations showing that 300 operational U-boats would be sufficient to strangle Britain's supply lines, a number they finally achieved in early 1943 only to discover that those 300 submarines were now the hunted rather than the hunters, unable to even find convoys, much less attack them successfully. The escort carriers had eliminated the mid-Atlantic air gap that German strategy depended upon, their aircraft extending Allied air coverage across the entire ocean, creating an environment where U-boats could never surface safely, where every moment on the surface risked sudden death from aircraft that appeared without warning, where even successful attacks on convoys meant almost certain destruction from the carrier aircraft that responded immediately. USS Guadalcanal's hunter-killer group achieved perhaps the greatest intelligence coup of the Atlantic War on June 4, 1944, when her aircraft damaged U-505 so severely that the submarine couldn't dive, Captain Daniel Gallery ordering a boarding party to capture the U-boat intact before her crew could scuttle her, securing codebooks, an Enigma machine, and technical documentation that provided invaluable intelligence about German submarine capabilities. The capture of U-505, now preserved as a museum ship in Chicago, demonstrated the complete reversal of fortune in the Atlantic, American sailors boarding a German submarine on the high seas, her crew prisoners, her secrets revealed, the hunters now so thoroughly defeated that they could be captured like prizes from an earlier age of naval warfare. The technological surprise of escort carriers was amplified by other innovations the Germans failed to anticipate, particularly centimetric radar operating at wavelengths their detection equipment couldn't receive, high-frequency direction finding that could track a U-boat's radio transmission to within a mile, magnetic anomaly detection that could find a submerged submarine by the distortion it created in Earth's magnetic field, and sonobuoys that could be dropped by aircraft to listen for submarine propeller noise. Each of these technologies represented years of Allied research and development that German intelligence either didn't detect or dismissed as impossible, their technical staff so confident in German scientific superiority that they couldn't imagine the Allies had surpassed them, a hubris that cost them the Battle of the Atlantic. The escort carrier USS Block Island demonstrated the persistence that these ships brought to submarine hunting when her aircraft spotted U-boats on 5 consecutive days in October 1943. Maintaining contact despite weather that grounded land-based aircraft, her air group flying in conditions that would have been considered impossible just 2 years earlier, using radar to find targets in clouds and rain, attacking submarines that surfaced at night thinking darkness would protect them. Block Island's aircraft sank U-220 on October 28, damaged U-256 so badly she had to abort her patrol, and forced 3 other boats to remain submerged until their batteries were exhausted, the carrier's persistent presence making it impossible for the U-boats to operate effectively, their commanders reporting that they spent more time evading aircraft than hunting merchant ships. The German submarine U-117, a Type XB mine layer converted to a supply submarine, met her fate on August 7, 1943, caught on the surface by aircraft from USS Card while transferring fuel to U-66, both submarines with fuel hoses connected, unable to dive quickly, their crews scrambling to disconnect the refueling equipment while aircraft dove on them from multiple directions. Lieutenant Asbury Salinger dropped depth charges that bracketed U-117 while his wingman strafed U-66. The attack so sudden that neither submarine managed to man their anti-aircraft guns effectively, U-117 taking fatal damage to her pressure hull while U-66 escaped by crash diving with fuel hoses still attached, trailing oil that marked her position for miles, only surviving because Card's aircraft focused on finishing off the valuable supply submarine. The destruction of U-117 and her sister supply submarines created a crisis for U-boat operations that went far beyond the simple loss of hulls and crews, each tanker submarine that was sunk forcing dozens of attack boats to abort their patrols early for lack of fuel, the entire German submarine offensive in distant waters collapsing as boats operating off the American coast, in the Caribbean, off West Africa, and in the Indian Ocean found themselves without refueling support. The escort carriers had identified and systematically hunted down the supply submarines using intelligence from decoded radio messages that revealed refueling rendezvous points, their aircraft arriving precisely when both submarines were most vulnerable, on the surface with fuel lines connected, unable to dive, turning what should have been routine operations into death traps. The psychological warfare aspect of escort carrier operations proved almost as effective as their physical attacks, U-boat crews never knowing when aircraft might appear, the stress of constant vigilance exhausting men who had to assume that every moment on the surface might be their last, that every cloud might hide an avenger with depth charges, that even the empty ocean offered no safety from an enemy that seemed omnipresent. Captain Lieutenant Werner Haenke, commanding U-515, reported that his crew had become so jumpy that they were seeing aircraft that didn't exist, forcing crash dives that depleted batteries and made it impossible to maintain contact with convoys. Men breaking down under the strain of operations that had gone from dangerous to nearly suicidal, requesting transfers to shore duty rather than face another patrol. HMS Audacity, the world's first escort carrier, had proved the concept in December 1941 when her 6 Martlet fighters shot down 4 German Fokker Wolf Condor maritime patrol bombers and drove off numerous U-boat attacks on convoy HG-76, demonstrating that even a small converted merchant ship with a handful of obsolete fighters could transform the tactical situation around a convoy. But Audacity was sunk by U-751 on December 21st, and it would be more than a year before escort carriers appeared in significant numbers, a delay that cost thousands of Allied lives and hundreds of ships that might have been saved if the potential of escort carriers had been recognized earlier, their production prioritized over other naval construction. The American escort carrier production program demonstrated industrial capability that German planners simply couldn't comprehend, the Kaiser shipyards in Vancouver, Washington, launching a new Casablanca-class escort carrier every week by late 1943, using prefabricated sections and assembly line techniques that reduced construction time to less than 3 months from keel laying to commissioning. Henry Kaiser had promised President Roosevelt 50 carriers in a year, a claim that seemed impossible to German naval experts who required 2 years to build a single submarine, but Kaiser delivered, his yards producing escort carriers faster than the Navy could train crews to man them, some ships waiting weeks after completion for their air groups to finish training. The Casablanca class, of which USS Guadalcanal was a member, displaced only 8,000 tons compared to the 27,000 tons of an Essex-class fleet carrier, with a flight deck just 477 feet long, barely enough for an unloaded Avenger to take off, their pilots requiring exceptional skill to operate from such small decks in the rough waters of the North Atlantic. But what they lacked in size they made up in numbers. 50 Casablanca-class carriers commissioned between July 1943 and July 1944, each one capable of maintaining anti-submarine patrols over thousands of square miles of ocean, collectively eliminating any possibility of U-boats operating safely on the surface anywhere in the Atlantic. The escort carriers also revolutionized convoy defense by providing continuous air cover that eliminated the U-boat's primary tactical advantage, their ability to shadow convoys on the surface during daylight, using their 17-knot speed to position themselves ahead of the convoy's track for coordinated night attacks. Tactics that had allowed wolf packs to savage convoys in 1940 and 1941. With an escort carrier stationed inside the convoy formation, its aircraft maintaining constant patrols out to 50 miles in all directions, U-boats couldn't get close enough to see the convoy during daylight, and at night, radar-equipped aircraft could detect them the moment they surfaced, either attacking immediately or vectoring in destroyers to prosecute the contact. Composite Squadron 9 from USS Bogue pioneered the use of night operations against U-boats, their Avengers equipped with radar and powerful searchlights that could illuminate a submarine from a mile away, giving the U-boat crew less than 20 seconds to react before depth charges were falling around them, not enough time to dive to safe depth. Their only option to remain on the surface and try to fight it out with anti-aircraft guns against an enemy they could barely see. Lieutenant Roger Santee flying a radar-equipped Avenger from Bogue caught U-161 on the surface at night on September 27, 1943. His searchlight illuminating the submarine so suddenly that the German lookouts were literally frozen in shock, standing motionless as depth charges exploded around them, the submarine sinking in less than 30 seconds with only 2 survivors from 53 crew members. The German Naval Command's response to the escort carrier threat revealed their complete inability to adapt to the new reality of the Atlantic War. Dönitz ordering technological solutions that were years from deployment, new submarine types with higher underwater speed, snorkels that would allow battery charging while submerged, acoustic torpedoes to attack escort vessels, believing that technology could restore the advantage his submarines had lost. But these innovations wouldn't be available until 1945, far too late to affect the outcome of the Atlantic battle, and in the meantime his existing submarines were being slaughtered by an enemy they couldn't see, couldn't detect, and couldn't escape, their crews demoralized and desperate, some commanders refusing to leave port, others deliberately seeking internment in neutral ports rather than face the escort carrier aircraft. By October 1943, the escort carrier hunter-killer groups had established such dominance over the mid-Atlantic that U-boats were ordered to avoid the area entirely, Dönitz shifting his submarines to the Indian Ocean and Arctic where escort carriers hadn't yet deployed in significant numbers, essentially conceding defeat in the Atlantic battle that Germany had to win to have any hope of defeating Britain. The statistics were devastating. In 1942, U-boats had sunk over 6 million tons of Allied shipping while losing only 87 submarines, a ratio that if sustained would have starved Britain into submission, but by late 1943, they were sinking less than 200,000 tons per month while losing 30 to 40 submarines, A complete reversal that meant the U-boat force was being destroyed without achieving any strategic impact. The human cost was even more telling. The U-boat force that had started the war with confidence and high morale, whose commanders were celebrated as heroes in German propaganda, the Grey Wolves who would bring Britain to her knees, reduced to a demoralized force with the highest casualty rate of any German military branch, 75% of all U-boat crew members killed during the war, 30,000 men out of 40,000 who served. The escort carriers bore significant responsibility for this slaughter, their aircraft hunting U-boats with such persistence that submarine patrols became suicide missions. Young men going to sea knowing they had only a 1 in 4 chance of surviving, their commanders reporting that crews were refusing orders, sabotaging their own boats, anything to avoid another patrol in waters dominated by American carrier aircraft. USS Card demonstrated the thoroughness of escort carrier operations when her hunter-killer group sank 8 U-boats in a single deployment from July to October 1943, her aircraft flying over 1,300 hours, attacking submarines on 27 different occasions, forcing dozens more to remain submerged until their batteries were exhausted, effectively neutralizing an entire section of the German submarine fleet. Captain Arnold Isbell received the Navy Cross for this deployment, his systematic hunting technique serving as a model for other escort carrier groups, using intelligence to position his carrier in areas where U-boats were likely to transit, maintaining continuous air patrols that gave submarines no opportunity to surface safely, his destroyer escorts following up any contact until the submarine was destroyed or forced to surface from battery exhaustion. The German submarine U-402, commanded by Captain Lieutenant Siegfried von Forstner, experienced the relentless nature of escort carrier hunting when aircraft from USS Card found her on October 13, 1943, attacking immediately with depth charges that damaged her diving planes, forcing her to surface where she was attacked again, diving once more only to be depth-charged by destroyer escorts, surfacing again to be strafed by fighters. This deadly game of cat and mouse, continuing for 6 hours until U-402 finally succumbed. Only 17 men survived from a crew of 49, pulled from the water by American destroyers, their testimonies describing the terror of being hunted by an enemy that never gave up, that seemed to have unlimited aircraft and weapons, that turned the ocean into a killing ground where submarines had no chance of escape. The impact of escort carriers extended beyond direct combat to intelligence gathering, their aircraft photographing U-boats on the surface, identifying new equipment and tactics, capturing German submarine crews who provided invaluable information about everything from new acoustic torpedoes to morale problems in the U-boat bases, intelligence that allowed the Allies to anticipate and counter German innovations before they could become effective. When aircraft from USS Gallery's Guadalcanal captured U-505, they secured not just the submarine but tons of documentation including the settings for Naval Enigma for the coming months, maintenance manuals for new equipment, and personal letters that revealed the desperate state of morale in the U-boat force. Intelligence so valuable that the capture was kept secret until after the war. The escort carrier USS Block Island paid the ultimate price for her aggressive hunting on May 29, 1944, torpedoed by U-549 while operating northwest of the Canary Islands, the only American carrier lost in the Atlantic during World War II, her sinking demonstrating that U-boats could still strike back when given the opportunity. But even in her destruction, Block Island proved the effectiveness of the hunter-killer concept, her escorting destroyer escorts immediately counterattacking and sinking U-549 within hours, and within weeks, a new Block Island was commissioned and deployed to continue the hunt, the industrial might of American shipyards ensuring that losses could be replaced faster than the Germans could inflict them, a reality that made ultimate German defeat inevitable. The technological superiority that escort carriers brought to the Atlantic battle was perhaps best demonstrated by the phyto-acoustic homing torpedo, a weapon so secret that even most American naval officers didn't know it existed, dropped by aircraft to home in on the sound of a submarine's propellers, pursuing its target relentlessly until impact, impossible to evade by conventional submarine tactics. German submarine commanders who survived phyto attacks reported torpedoes that seemed to chase them underwater, that turned when they turned, that followed them through crash dives and evasive maneuvers, weapons that seemed to violate the laws of physics as German naval engineers understood them, creating panic among crews who realized that diving was no longer a guarantee of safety from air attack. Lieutenant Commander Marshall Greer, commanding USS Card, perfected the technique of using multiple escort carriers to create an impenetrable barrier across U-boat transit routes. his carrier working with USS Card and USS Bogue to establish patrol lines that no submarine could cross undetected, their aircraft overlapping coverage areas so that any submarine forced to dive by one carrier's planes would still be submerged when the next carrier's aircraft arrived, keeping U-boats down until their batteries were exhausted and they had to surface regardless of the danger. This technique proved so effective that by November 1943, not a single U-boat successfully crossed the mid-Atlantic to attack convoys on the North American coast, the entire German submarine offensive in American waters collapsing from lack of boats able to make the passage. The German effort to counter escort carriers with enhanced anti-aircraft armament reached its peak with the deployment of U-boats equipped with quadruple 20mm guns and automatic 37mm cannons. Weapons that theoretically could create a wall of fire that no aircraft could penetrate, their crews trained to remain on the surface and fight it out rather than dive when attacked. But when these flak boats encountered escort carrier aircraft in combat, they discovered that the Americans didn't attack individually as expected but in coordinated groups, 4, 6, even 8 aircraft attacking simultaneously from different directions, saturating the submarine's defenses, the anti-aircraft guns unable to track multiple targets while under strafing attack from fighters whose 650 caliber machine guns could sweep a submarine's deck clean of life in seconds. U-758's destruction on May 14, 1943, by aircraft from USS Bogue demonstrated the futility of the anti-aircraft strategy when 4 Avengers and 2 Wildcats caught her on the surface, the submarine's enhanced armament managing to damage one Avenger before being overwhelmed by attacks from multiple directions, her entire gun crew killed in the first strafing run, depth charges breaking her hull before she could dive. The few survivors reported that the attack developed so quickly and from so many directions that effective defense was impossible, the gunners unable to decide which aircraft to engage, their weapons unable to elevate fast enough to track diving aircraft. The entire concept of fighting on the surface revealed as a desperate gamble that only increased crew casualties without improving survival chances. The battle off Samar on October 25, 1944, demonstrated that escort carriers could influence surface battles as well as anti-submarine warfare when 6 escort carriers of Type III faced the Japanese center force including the battleship Yamato, their aircraft attacking with such determination that Admiral Kurita became convinced he was facing fleet carriers and withdrew, a decision that saved the American invasion fleet at Leyte. The Japanese misidentification of the escort carriers as fleet carriers revealed how these small ships had become indistinguishable in combat effectiveness from their larger cousins, their aircraft just as capable of delivering devastating attacks, their presence transforming any tactical situation, whether hunting submarines or defending against surface ships. The industrial achievement of escort carrier production went beyond simple numbers to include innovations in construction techniques that German engineers considered impossible. Kaiser's shipyards using welding instead of riveting to reduce construction time by 70%. Prefabricating entire sections of ships that were assembled like giant models. Installing engines and equipment before the hull was complete. Techniques that reduced construction time from 2 years to 10 weeks. German naval architects studying captured documentation after the war expressed disbelief that ships built so quickly could be effective warships. Yet these rapidly constructed escort carriers proved more than adequate for their mission, their presence in the Atlantic making German submarine operations virtually impossible by mid-1944. The human dimension of escort carrier operations was equally remarkable. Young American pilots, many with less than 200 hours of flight time, learning to take off and land on pitching decks in the North Atlantic, flying in weather that would have grounded aircraft just 2 years earlier, attacking submarines defended by experienced gunners, accepting casualty rates that exceeded those of many infantry units. Ensign John Ballantyne, who scored the first Fido kill, was just 22 years old, had been a college student in 1941, yet found himself flying a complex aircraft from a tiny carrier deck, using secret weapons to hunt submarines commanded by veterans with years of combat experience, the generational change in warfare that saw American youth with superior technology defeating German experience and skill. The escort carrier USS Santee demonstrated the versatility of these ships when she survived both a torpedo hit from U-402 and a kamikaze attack on the same day during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, her crew conducting damage control while her aircraft continued flying anti-submarine patrols, proving that these converted merchant ships could absorb battle damage and continue operating, their crews trained to standards that equaled those of fleet carriers. The survival of Santee after damage that would have sunk most merchant ships validated the design philosophy of escort carriers, that simple, robust ships with trained crews could perform missions previously reserved for expensive, purpose-built warships, democratizing naval aviation in a way that transformed maritime warfare. The intelligence support that enabled escort carrier operations represented another Allied advantage that Germany never matched. The 10th Fleet in Washington collecting information from dozens of sources, correlating U-boat sightings, radio intercepts, decoded messages, and prisoner interrogations to create a comprehensive picture of German submarine operations, information that was transmitted to escort carriers at sea in near real time. Captain Daniel Gallery, commanding USS Guadalcanal, received daily intelligence updates that told him not just where U-boats were operating but their fuel states, their remaining torpedoes, even the names and temperaments of their commanders, information that allowed him to predict submarine behavior and position his hunter-killer group for maximum effectiveness. By December 1943, the transformation of the Atlantic battle was complete, escort carriers and their hunter-killer groups having established such dominance that U-boats were reduced to mine-laying and weather reporting, their offensive capability destroyed, their bases under constant air attack, their crews demoralized and desperate, the gray wolves that had terrorized the Atlantic reduced to hunted fugitives trying simply to survive. Grossadmiral Dönitz, who had promised Hitler that U-boats would strangle Britain, was forced to report that the submarine war was lost, that no amount of courage or determination could overcome the technological superiority of escort carrier aircraft, that Germany's best hope was to preserve the U-boat force for bargaining power in eventual peace negotiations, an admission of complete defeat from the officer who had made submarine warfare the centerpiece of German naval strategy. The final accounting of escort carrier effectiveness in the Atlantic was stark. 53 U-boats sunk directly by escort carrier aircraft, dozens more by the destroyer escorts they worked with, hundreds forced to abort patrols, thousands of crew members killed or captured. The entire German submarine offensive reduced from strategic threat to tactical nuisance, all achieved by converting merchant ships into aircraft carriers and training reserve pilots to fly from them. The escort carriers had proved that industrial capacity and technological innovation could overcome traditional naval power, that America's ability to mass-produce both ships and aircraft could transform warfare, that the Atlantic Ocean itself could be turned into an American lake where German submarines operated only at the sufferance of carrier aircraft that owned the skies above. The story of escort carriers in the Atlantic was ultimately one of industrial triumph over military tradition. American shipyards producing carriers faster than German shipyards could produce submarines, American factories building aircraft faster than U-boats could shoot them down, American training programs producing pilots faster than combat could eliminate them, a total war effort that Germany simply couldn't match. When U-boat ace Wolfgang Luth was asked after the war what had defeated the submarine force, he answered simply, "The escort carriers. We could handle the destroyers, we could avoid the land-based aircraft, but the escort carriers were everywhere, their aircraft appearing from nowhere, giving us no peace, no respite, no chance to fight back. They hunted us to extinction." The legacy of escort carriers extended far beyond their wartime service, establishing the concept of sea control through air power that would dominate naval strategy for the rest of the 20th century, proving that aircraft carriers didn't need to be massive, expensive capital ships to be effective, that smaller, simpler carriers could perform vital missions if properly employed. The helicopter carriers and amphibious assault ships of modern navies trace their lineage directly to the escort carriers of World War II, ships that proved that putting aircraft at sea in large numbers was more important than putting them on perfect platforms, a lesson that transformed naval warfare permanently. In the end, the German U-boat force that had entered the war as the most feared naval weapon in Hitler's arsenal, that had come within measurable distance of starving Britain into submission in 1941 and early 1942, was destroyed by converted merchant ships carrying obsolete aircraft flown by reserve pilots, a David and Goliath story that demonstrated the triumph of Allied industrial democracy over German military authoritarianism. The escort carriers had turned the hunters into the hunted, the Atlantic from a German killing ground into an Allied highway, the U-boats from strategic weapons into iron coffins for the 30,000 German sailors who died in them, their destruction so complete that when Germany surrendered in May 1945, only 2 U-boats were still operational in the Atlantic, hiding in Norwegian fjords, afraid to put to sea where escort carrier aircraft still patrolled, waiting to finish the job they had started 2 years earlier. The Battle of the Atlantic had been won not by battleships or fleet carriers, not by traditional naval power or professional military excellence, but by escort carriers built in 3 months by shipyard workers who had been building bridges a year earlier, flown by pilots who had been college students, commanded by reserve officers who had been businessmen, A triumph of citizen sailors over professional warriors that validated the American approach to war through industrial mobilization. The escort carriers had proved that, in modern war, quantity had a quality of its own, that technological surprise could overcome tactical experience, that air power projected from even the smallest carriers could dominate vast ocean areas, lessons that would shape naval strategy for generations to come. The ghost of every U-boat they sank, a testament to the transformation of naval warfare they had achieved.